Welcome to part 5 of the instructional video series for Rocket Lasso's Slicer plugin. In this video, we are going to be talking about the Spline tab. Clicking Extensions or Plugin dropdown, we can get the slicer, move it to the bottom, remote into an object. The object will be text. Let's pivot from the bottom, move it down a bit maybe, and create a bunch of slices. Now, one thing that we're going to be seeing here, let's hide that object, is, okay, cool, we're creating all these slices going all the way across, and it seems like that'd be pretty cool. That warning pops up right down here. It says, hey, open edges detected. It's like, oh wait, that makes sense. This isn't a volume, so we're not creating full slices. We're just creating a single line cutting across a polygon object because this is so thin. So this being a closed spline will make things break, and this is why we built that warning in. So if I were to feed this, as it is right now, into a sweep, and then feed that sweep something like a end side, T for scale, scale it down, which does look pretty cool, but we're going to get all sorts of weirdness that we're not expecting, where, like, why don't these have caps? Well, it's because it's a closed spline. It's looping from the beginning to the end, and it can drive you nuts if you're like, why isn't this behaving the way I'm expecting to? Well, that's why we put the warning in there. You can say, switch to an open spline. Now, moving into the spline tab instead of clicking the button, all that would do is change spline from closed to open. And as soon as we do that, you can now see that those are closing properly because that is now a single cut across and you get a nice clean line. So this is an entire other area of exploration of cool looking things you can make, making two-dimensional lines on things. We can make as many cuts as we want, make this type of shape. We're going to be covering a lot of examples of that type of stuff inside of the live stream and in the quick start video. But in any case, that is the first thing, is making a spline open. Now let's move into some other setups. Pulling the slicer out temporarily, how about we make this dimensional? So on the text, I'll say, okay, you can have some thickness again, jump that up to 50, and now we're cutting an entire volume, which means now these could have dimension to them. They can close. So yeah, let's close them again and hide that original text. The actual first setting inside of the spline tab is reverse. So dragging this back inside of our sweep, let's show that by grabbing the end scale and dropping that down to 0. So now it's actually tapering down to 0. Now that does look pretty consistent overall. It's looking pretty good. But do you remember we talked about earlier in a different video, in the modify tab, we have the set first point. That can be very important for the direction of this type of thing, and that's why that was built. Currently it's trying to figure it out based on the X and Z, but if you left it on none, it might end up kind of chaotic. It's kind of working right now. If you do random, they're going to be all over the place, which could be a cool look. You see that that one begins there. This one begins over here. So yeah, a little bit of randomizing there can be neat. Let's scale that up a bit to see even more. So yeah, that's cool. But let's go back to the point of what if we wanted to reverse these? Well, we can say reverse, and now they're spinning the opposite direction to what they were before. Depending on what you're doing, that can be incredibly important. Then we've got our spline, which is currently set to closed, but we already saw we can set it to open. And even here we say open, and now it's going to open up one of those edges, depending on which one it randomly started on. So again, pretty cool looking. We also have a mode called open and closed. Now, before we get there, let's take a look at what this spline is returning. Let's pull it out. And if I make this editable, you'll see it's a single spline. It's got a bunch of segments inside of it, but it's one spline. And it says it's an open spline. So we could do open, we could do closed, but that's all we have. We don't have an open and closed. It's open or it's closed. That's what Cinema expects. So what does that mean to set a spline to open and closed? Well, first of all, we need a scenario to see that. So temporarily turn off that text and let's make ourselves a brand new landscape object. I'm gonna make it extra tall and tilt it over a bit. Feeding that in as our source object, we'll temporarily turn off the text. You will see that we get, in this case, what would be open and closed splines. So currently it's set to open. I'm going to set it to close because that's our default. You can see, these lines travel around the outside and eventually they go back to where they started. That makes perfect sense. But if we look down here, some of the lines are now reaching the edge because of the way I tilted it. But now they're still closed splines. You see they interconnect on the edges there. And that's, in a lot of circumstances, definitely not something that you want. How about we set that to be open instead? Well, if you set it to open, all these other splines are going to have an open edge somewhere that doesn't quite connect. So you can see if I say closed, you see all these little lines all over the place suddenly look a little bit different. Bing! You see like right there, that gap suddenly appears because it's now an open spline, doesn't close. So instead, let's set that to open and closed mode. It's like, okay, cool. Now those look like they're closed, and these are not interconnecting anymore. Seems perfect, like ready to go. However, Cinema doesn't like this type of setup because, once again, a spline has to be open or has to be closed. So let me show you what's actually happening. If I throw this into a sweep, you can see, well, look, those open lines are all going, but these closed ones aren't doing anything. Those are not being swept. Why is that? Well, pulling out the slicer, if we make it editable, you'll see what it's currently returning is a null. Inside of that null is an open spline and a closed spline, each with their checkbox turned on or off. And like I said, it has to be one or the other. If we were to feed both of these inside of a connect object, let's grab both and put them into a connect, you will see that these other ones have now popped open again. You can see all these open edges appeared because the first spline in there was open. So the connect says, okay, they're all open. If we make this editable, let's say single spline, that's open. Anyway, it's a long preamble for what's really important here for this setting. Hitting undo. Okay, we're back here. We are now open and closed, and we're returning open and closed. But we can say, hey, let's feed that in and say return only open. So now only the open ones are returning. And now duplicate the entire sweep and say that slicer should return the closed ones. And so that's a way of getting around it. We can now have closed splines and open splines by duplicating it once, and we're returning only open, we're returning only closed. So I think it's a pretty good system and pretty powerful, and there'd be a lot of situations that you wouldn't be able to create what you want to if you couldn't do that. So yeah, that's working just fine for us. We don't need all this, so let's pull that out and go back to our regular. In fact, let's go back to the text instead. I don't think we need the landscape anymore. So let's go back to this setup and return this back to return closed. There we go. Everything's back to kind of defaults. Okay, moving on. We have segments. Well, with segments, currently it's returning none, so there's no exploded segments. If I say make this editable, we're returning a single spline, of course. But if I say segments explode layer and I hit make editable, you'll see it's actually returning a null with a series of splines. Now, we talked about it in the geometry video that Cinema, the extrude, is smart enough to be able to figure out this type of hierarchy. It sees that just fine, but certain other things don't, so you gotta be careful about when you use or don't use it. But keep in mind that this is what is getting returned, is a null with a series of layers. But by returning a series of layers, we've now unlocked the ability to use the colorize parameter. Before we get there, though, there is one last segment mode, and that is explode all. Because we're exploding a layer, there's a cut that's going from here, across there, across there, across there. It's like layer. Cut 10 is across all of these different letters, so it will return that. But if you say explode all, then every individual segment will be returned as its own object. So that's an object, that's an object, that's an object, that's an object. So important to note. Okay, back to explode layer. I shall lock the slicer and then deselect it so we can actually see these colors, because otherwise it's just highlighting it. So now that we are locked, I can say colorize these exploded layers based on what? Well, we got a lot of options. We'll skip as input for a moment, but let's go to grayscale. You can now see that every one of those spline segments, in this case layers, is a different grayscale color. Feeding this into third-party renderers will enable you to create all sorts of cool colors really quickly. And gradient mapping or ramp remapping this would enable you to create any colors that you want. In addition, we have a random, which will return every random color imaginable. You can click this random seed button and get completely different colors returning, which is pretty cool. And then we've got from matrix, which we talked about in the second video when we talked about the matrix object. But if these slices were being created by a matrix, we could take on the color of the matrix, once again integrating Mograph tools directly into slicer. For the next one, I'm going to set segments to explode all. Colorize, I will say as input, and then unlock this so I can now select the text object. So you'll see that slicer is smart enough to take on the color of individual objects. In this case, it's the text object, and I want to show that one because it's kind of an exception. If you go to the basic tab and turn on your display color and set it to something, it's not going to work. And that's because this is technically a Mograph object. So if I go under letters, there is a transform tab that you can twirl up, and that is the actual color of this object. So you can now see the colors changing based on this color. It can get even more exciting though. Let's turn that off, not feed it in, and instead let's unlock this cloner set up with a bunch of colors. just a cube inside a cloner. So tell the slicer to look at the cloner, and now we've got a whole bunch of cuts going there. Let's hide the cloner, deselect it, and you'll see that it's taken on the color of every single one of those individual clones. So that's pretty cool. You just have to make sure that it is exploded, and it will return this. And again, you have to make sure that you are in explode all to do that, because one layer would be cutting across multiple colors, and how would it decide the colors? You have to explode all to make sure that that works. But yeah, we've now taken on those random colors, looking pretty cool. Now, I would like to put the text back on. So let's turn the text on, turn the cloner off, and we've got that going. Back to random colors, just for fun. Random from layer, and now we got these random colors. Let's create even more slices, why not? So a bunch more slices. Now, the next setting we've got is, well, let's tag the segments. Before we get there, let's look at enabling these different spline interpolations. I can say enable, and this is a way of subdividing this text or setting it to these different spline modes. So I could say, actually, I would like the spline type not to be linear, but to be something like a B-spline, and you'll see that we'll get a nice curvy bunch of text coming out of that. Might be a good idea to make sure that you turn off remove redundant points. It might make it a little bit more consistent, but then again, it'll look kind of cool this way. You can always take your slicer and rotate this to some other angle, and then select the very handy auto scale. And now we've got all those slices going across, just having some fun with it. So back into the spline tab, I would like to be able to have these random colors render, and third-party renderers can handle that type of thing. So I'm going to use Redshift because that's what I've got installed. So here's a Redshift material. If I double click it, it'll pop open. And the only thing I've done is I turned on the emission and I gave it a lot of weight. So typically that'd be at 0. I set it up to 5. So let's search for the user data node. So user, here's color user data. I would like to output the display color of the object, output that into the emission, and now that should be able to translate into this material. So let's apply that material and then open up Redshift's render view and then hit go. And we're not really seeing much. In fact, we're only seeing these cubes. Why is that? Well, Redshift doesn't render splines out of the gate. We have to right click on the object, add a Redshift object tag, and then under curve, say mode, whatever we want. I'll say hair strands, and then still nothing happens. Why did nothing happen here? Well, that's the next setting inside of Slicer. If we were to make this editable right now, you'll see that what's actually happening is we got a whole series of splines, but there's no Redshift tag on them. And Redshift, the tag doesn't filter to children automatically. And that's why we set up a way of compensating for it. Inside of Slicer, inside of the Spline tab, there is a tag to segments. So if I drag that tag onto it, it is now going to copy that tag to all of the children. And if I make it editable, you'll see that each child has an identical version of that tag. It can now render, and it's rendering out those colors. Those colors could change anything. We hit the randomized seed, and you'll see those will change. We can change that to be the grayscale. That could be based off the matrix that was being fed in. Whatever is driving it, that will now show up as a render, and it's crazy fast to render splines inside of third-party renderers, which is great. And it's important to note that this tool was designed as a spline tool, and all of that geometry stuff kind of came later. So this was its primary goal, was rendering and creating things with splines. But in any case, that is going to wrap up the instructional videos. Make sure that you watch the quick start video because there's a bunch of cool projects in there. Also included in the zip file is a bunch of different example files. Be sure to check those out. And in the main tab, you do have the help button and the examples button to go and watch these videos again, or to see in the future, to go see a bunch of example files that you might be able to reverse engineer and create really cool things with. But in any case, thank you for purchasing Slicer and supporting Rocket Lasso, and I'll see you in a future tutorial or live stream. Bye-bye, everybody.